Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah, and today I'm going to show you how to create a projectile or player attack using Unity, and this will be using scripting in Unity. So what we will cover in this, how to fire a projectile from the player, first of all, then how to make enemies be killed by this projectile, and how to then make the player do an attack animation when they're firing, and finally how to make the projectile disappear after a short time. So these four things are what's going to be covered. Now I will also give some tips on how to expand these further, but I'm only going to cover the basics in this tutorial. Now you don't need much already set up for this project in order to get it to work. You should definitely have some assets. So you need to have a player, you need to have some assets for a projectile, for an enemy, but you don't need too much else. Now, it might be nice to have movement for your player, and I do have a tutorial on player health also. The player health will be used as an example if you want to add enemy health, so you may want to do that first, but it's not required. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is create our projectile so that we can actually fire it. So to do that, I have in my project already made here some assets, and I've got one that's I'm going to use for my projectile. It kind of looks like a fireball, so my player's firing a Kamehameha. And I'm going to just drag that into Unity to create a game object. So remember, if you drag a sprite into Unity, it creates a game object of it. And now I have a projectile over here. I'm going to, if you did not have a name for this projectile already, if it wasn't named well, you should now change the name of that, but mine is already named projectile, and that's absolutely fine. The next step is to add some components to this projectile, some existing Unity components. And what we're going to add first of all a trigger to this, a collider to this. And to find what type of collider you add is up to you. But if you're making a 2D game, you definitely need to add a 2D collider. So what I'm doing here is I've gone to projectile, clicked add component, and I'm just going to type in collider 2D. And you should get a set of the possible colliders that you can use. If your object is fairly circular, I would recommend a circle collider. They have very good performance. If your object is more box-shaped, I would recommend a box collider. I would recommend using one of these two types, or maybe a capsule if need be. But I don't recommend using a polygon collider unless you have a very complex shape that must have pixel-perfect collision. And in most cases in game development, you don't need pixel-perfect collision, so I wouldn't recommend using that unless you really need to. Okay, so I'm going to add the circle collider to mine. And what you can see in Unity here is that a nice green outline has been added around here to show where my collider is. Now, if your sprite is slightly off center or something, it might not be correct. So what you'll need to do then is you can click on Edit Collider to change the settings on that, or you can change the offset and radius manually. And those settings will be slightly different if you used a box collider, but it's still the same. There will be a button there where there'll be settings that you can change to alter how that collider is set up. Now, colliders in Unity can have two modes. One is normal collision, where it will actually block movement, and one is a trigger. And for our projectile, we're going to make it a trigger so that it does not actually, it will actually pass through things. And the reason we want to do that is whenever we fire this projectile, it's going to fire off where our player is. And we don't want to have to worry about it colliding with our player and shunting our player backwards when we fire it. We just want it to pass through them freely. So let's go ahead and add a is trigger to our projectile. So that's in the collider, you're adding is trigger. Now you're saying, oh no, but I wanted to hit my enemy. Well, that's fine. What a trigger does is it will tell our script that we have collided with something. It just won't physically stop the motion. Okay, so that's fine for our projectile. The only things that you really want to have collision on them is if you're actually wanting to maybe push something, or if you want something to block movement, like a wall blocking a player. So both the player and the wall would need a non-trigger collider on them. Okay, so the next component we need to add here is a rigidbody 2D. So, and that's if you're making a 2D game. If you're following this tutorial and making a 3D game, then you want to change that to a rigidbody 3D, or just a normal rigidbody. But for those making 2D games, which is what this is primarily aimed at, you're going to want a rigidbody 2D. So I've clicked add component, I've typed in rigid, and you'll see there's two here. And this is your physics component. So what we want to do is we want to make this projectile as simple as possible. So we're going to change this projectile so it has 0 friction and 0 gravity, and it's just going to go forever in a straight line when we give it an initial velocity. Now, if you don't want your projectile to behave that way, if you want your projectile to slow down over time, or you want it to have an arc so it curves downward, you can skip this step. But for most people, we don't want our projectile to start slowing down. We want it to just give it an initial velocity and it keeps going. That's what we want. So let's go ahead and change the linear drag is already at 0, so it already will not have any friction on it as it flies. But we want to change that gravity scale to 0 as well. Now this will look slightly different if you are on a 3D rigid body, but they should have similar settings. Okay, we are now almost ready for our projectile to be used, but we need to just create a prefab for it. So a reminder of what a prefab is. A prefab is like a blueprint. So what we want to do is we want to use this prefab to copy this projectile. When our player fires it, it's going to copy this prefab and it's going to make a new version of it, and that's what's going to actually fire. We don't want to have to keep this object in the scene for it to be copied. We don't want to have a bullet sitting somewhere and then copy it and fire it, especially if that bullet might be destroyed or disappear, because then our copying code won't work anymore because the thing we're copying is gone. So instead we use a prefab which saves that game object as a file, and then we can access it very easily. So to make a prefab, it's very, very simple. You need to, first of all, I would recommend having a prefab folder in your assets down here. And we can do that by right-clicking on Assets and doing Create Folder. And we're going to call that Prefabs. And then we're going to drag our projectile down into the Prefabs folder. And that will create a prefab file of our projectile. And up here you'll notice this projectile has turned blue. It has a blue icon now, and that's because it's associated with a prefab. So if we change this prefab, our projectile will actually change. Let's go ahead and delete the one in the scene for now so that you don't get confused. Never ever have your player copying things that are in the scene unless you really know what you're doing, because you are likely to have it be deleted later and then things won't work properly. So just to keep you right, delete that projectile that's in the scene once you have added it as a prefab. Okay, we have now created the prefab. We've done our setup step. So now we need to think about, what are we trying to do? We've got a projectile, right? We made it. We want to fire it when the player does something. So we need to think about our condition and our action. And if you always start thinking about that ahead of time when you're getting ready to program something, it will make your job a lot easier. So in here, we can say pretty easily what we're trying to do. We're trying to fire the projectile, right? Fire it in a certain direction. And we want to do this when the player presses a button. Now, this tutorial is going to show you how to do that with a mobile game, but you can do the exact same thing if you use an internal button in like a keyboard input or a gamepad input. So the first thing we're going to focus on then is the action itself, because it's going to be easier to set up our condition once the action's already done. It depends on the situation, which you do first, and it's absolutely fine if you're trying to figure things out on your own. If you pick one and you realize halfway through that you can't do that until you've done the condition, that's okay. It's a normal part of programming. I know which one's easier to do first because I've already done it, but when you're figuring it out, that's okay. If you get partway through a condition and you're like, I can't actually write the rest of this until I have the action code to call, that's fine. But we're going to do the action first, and we're going to set it up as a function. So the first thing we need to do is create a script to contain this action, and we're going to call it player fire to be like they're firing a projectile. So let's go to our scripts folder, and I already have some scripts here from previous tutorials. I'm going to right click on scripts, do create, and C# script, and remember to name it before you do anything else or the name won't stick. So let's call it player fire. Remember, no spaces, and you should use capital letters for the two words there and lowercase for the rest of the words. So player fire, the P and the F are capitalized. Okay, I'm going to then open up the script that I've just created into Visual Studio. We'll take a moment. And I'm going to drag it over here so you can see it. So this is what you get to begin with. Okay, so we are not going to use either of these, so we can delete those two functions. Remember to make sure you keep your curly brackets on either side because that's what your script actually uses. And we're going to go ahead and start off by creating some variables here. So let's say these are going to be Unity editor variables, which means that they can be edited in Unity. And in order to make a variable editable in Unity, you're going to use that word public at the beginning of it. So what kind of variables do we need here? Well, the most important variable that we absolutely need, even if we don't have anything else, is the prefab. We need to be able to tell our script what file it's going to be cloning, what game object is going to be cloning when it shoots these projectiles. So that's the absolute most important one. So we're going to make a public variable, game object, player, we'll call it projectile prefab. Okay, so this is going to take your projectile prefab that we just made, and we're going to put it into the Unity editor so that this variable gets filled in. It gets filled in by the Unity editor, and the thing inside this little variable box will be our projectile that we're going to copy, right? The blueprint. Okay, so then let's create a function to deal with this. So we're going to have a function, an action, fire a projectile. Okay, and we're going to make this a public function because we're going to use our on-screen buttons to call it, or you can use the player's script to call it, or somewhere else if you aren't using on-screen controls. So let's make this public, and it's going to not have any return type, so the return type will be void, and we're going to call it fire projectile, not project, projectile. And inside here, we're going to clone. So this is what we're actually, the guts of this action, what we're trying to do is clone the projectile and fire it in a direction. Okay, that's kind of the guts of what we're trying to do here. Okay, so let's go ahead and put projectile prefab. And we're going to use this projectile prefab to do something. To make this a little bit simpler, we're going to catch the result. So what we're going to do is we're going to clone our prefab, make a copy of it, and that's using a function in Unity called instantiate. You can look that function up in the Unity documents. And what instantiate does is it takes an object and it clones it, and it will give you the answer. So it's going to have a return type, and it's going to give you the answer. And we're going to catch that answer in another variable, and it's going to be a temporary variable. That's going to hold our cloned object. So the variable will be a game object because the thing that's being cloned is a game object. So the variable that comes back out of it will be a game object as well. So let's declare a variable here that's going to be used. Declare a variable to hold the cloned object. All right, and we're going to call that game object. That's the type for the variable, and we're going to call it cloned projectile. Okay, and now we're going to use instantiate to clone the projectile and keep the result in our variable. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we'll do the instantiate part first. So we're going to use instantiate, and then we just put in the variable here, and that is a projectile prefab. So this is going to take our projectile prefab and copy it. That's what instantiate does. But then instantiate, if you mouse over that, you'll actually see one thing, that you get a little pop-up telling you what the function does. And you can see on the far left there, it says game object. That's the return type. So this function is actually giving you back data. And right now, in the way I've written the code just now, we're not doing anything with it. It would be like if I asked you where your address to your house. And I'm like, hey, give me your address to your house. And then as you tell me, I go la, 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 and ignore you, instead of writing it down on a piece of paper so that I can have your address to your house. This is the writing it down on the piece of paper. This is keeping track of the thing we've just done. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add our cloned projectile variable here. And we're going to say that equals instantiate. So what we're doing is we're copying our projectile prefab using instantiate and storing the result in the cloned projectile variable. So now our cloned projectile variable contains our new projectile, our new bullet. So that's all ready to go. Now we just need to fire it. So how do we actually do that? Okay, well, the thing we really need to do is give it a velocity, an initial velocity. And to do that, we need to declare a variable to hold the cloned object's rigid body. All right, and then, so let's do that first. So we're going to have a rigid body 2D. So that's the type of the variable. And we'll say projectile rigid body. And then we need to get the rigid body from our cloned projectile and store it. So to store something, we would say projectile rigid body. Nope, that's the wrong thing. Sorry, I'm going to copy paste. Equals. And then on the right-hand side, we say what we're going to put into it. So we've got our projectile rigid body, new variable that we just made. It's a different type. That's why we're doing this. We can't set the velocity of a game object because not every game object has a velocity. But rigid body, the physics portion of a game object, that is where the velocity is located. So we need to get that physics object, that rigid body, out of our cloned projectile. So we do that, we create this variable to hold it, and then we set that new variable equal to cloned projectile.getComponent. We use these funky angle brackets, and we tell it what kind of component to get, and that's going to be the rigid body 2D. So this is going to our cloned projectile, and it's asking, hey projectile, give me your physics stuff. And then we put that physics stuff into this variable, and now we can use it. We can use that to set the velocity. Now, there's a really important distinction here I want to make sure you understand. Instantiate is making a copy. It's making a brand new projectile. But getComponent is not making a copy. The thing that we get back here is more like an address or a phone number. So if I use this projectile rigid body, it's not a brand new one. It is the one that is on our cloned object. So if we change it, it's going to change our cloned object. The difference here is if we change our cloned object, it's not going to change our projectile prefab. So when we change this rigid body velocity, it's not changing the velocity on every bullet everywhere. It's only changing the one that we made just then. Okay? So let's go ahead and actually set that velocity to something. The problem is, what do we set it to? We need to know how fast we want our bullets to fire. So let's go ahead and add another variable at the top here. And we're going to just do it at the very top. And it's going to be public vector to projectile velocity. And what this will do, we will set in here how fast we want our projectile to move once it's fired. And we're going to set that in the Unity editor. Well, why don't we set it in code? Because this is the kind of variable a designer would want to be able to change. So when we're coding things, we want to make sure that it's easy for the designer, even if that's you, to make changes, design changes. So this goes in the Unity editor so that the designer can very easily make this change whenever they want to. If they go, oh, those projectiles are firing too slow or too fast, they can really easily change it without having to edit their code. Okay, so how do we actually use that? Let's go down here and say set the velocity on the rigid body to the editor setting. So we use the projectile rigid body. Let's use that. And we use dot, which means go to that thing. It's like if I had your phone number and I actually called you, or I had your address and I actually went to your house to do something, right? So projectile rigid body dot go to the rigid body and do something. We're going to change the velocity, and we're going to set the velocity equal to our setting from Unity here. So projectile velocity. Okay. So this will change the velocity of the bullet once we've spawned it to be whatever our setting has told it to be. All right, so that will actually fire our bullet. Let's go ahead and save that. I did Control S to save that there. And we are ready to move on to the next step. Okay, So we need to actually make our player fire the projectile now. So we're going to click on our player here. This is where we're going to be adding our script. It's to the player, not to the projectile, because this script is to fire the projectile. The projectile is not going to fire itself, okay? The player is going to be the one firing the projectile. So this script does not go on the projectile. It goes on the player, the thing doing the action. So our player here is set up. We're going to drag our player fire to the player object, and that will add that script to the object. You can also use add component, but for my own scripts, I usually just drag them on. Okay, so if you look at your player now, you should have a player fire, and you will notice there are two sections here, one for projectile prefab and one for projectile velocity. If you don't see those, there are probably errors in your script, or you probably wouldn't have been able to attach the script in the first place. So pause the video and go deal with those errors and come back. Remember to carefully read your error text. All right, if you can see these, what you'll need to do is drag your projectile into the projectile prefab slot. Now, if you don't like doing it that way, you can also click this little circle over here, and that will open up a menu that will let you choose any projectile or any prefabs from your project. We only have the one, so we can easily choose it that way. So you can either drag or you can use that menu. The menu is also searchable, so it's actually quite useful. Then we're going to set our projectile velocity. So for now, I'm going to set this velocity to have an X component of 10. We'll see if that's any good. And that means it's going to fire in the X direction at a speed of 10 units per second. What is a unit? Well, it depends on how your game's set up, but usually a unit is roughly a meter. And you can see in my game here, you can actually see the units sort of as these squares. And it seems like that maybe is about the size of a player. So 10 units per second should be a good speed. It might be a little fast, a little slow, but it shouldn't be ridiculously fast or ridiculously slow. Okay, and so now my action is set up and ready to go. But remember that an action does nothing if you don't trigger the action from a condition. So our action here has been done. We need to actually trigger this. So for my code, I'm going to use an on-screen button to do this. But for you, you may not wish to use on-screen buttons if you're using a controller or keyboard for your game. So in that case, you would trigger this from an if statement in an update loop where you check the value of an input value. So you can use Unity's input to check a key. We're not doing this in this tutorial. I'm going to show you how to use an on-screen button in this case, but it's not too hard to extend this to work with a keyboard or controller. So how do we actually set that up? Well, we need to go to our UI. So I'm going to open up my canvas here. I'm going to click on one of my existing buttons and zoom back out here. And just to make things easy, I'm just going to copy and paste one of these buttons and move them over to the other side of the screen. And I'm going to change the button a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to change the name so that it matches properly. I'm going to call it fire. And I'm going to change the text on it to be fire so it's clear what it's doing. And I am going to change the script. Right now I have a held button script on here. I do not want my fire to work when held down, so I'm going to actually remove the held button script. But if you want your firing to work when it's held down, that's fine, but you will need to add something that I'm going to talk about later on to make that work properly. And finally, I want to change this. So the most important thing when you're changing a button is changing what it actually does. So I've got my fire button here, and right now it says on click, it's going to go to player movement, and it's going to call move up. We don't want that in this case. So what we actually want is for instead of player movement, we want it to call our new player fire script, and we want it to call fire projectile. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to drag our player in. The player is technically already there, but in case you had made this button from scratch, you didn't have the player, what you do is you drag the player into this slot. So I'm going to drag my player there. Remember that you're dragging a game object, not the script. You do not drag scripts in to these buttons. It won't run them properly. Okay, you need to drag the game object itself into that slot. Then once you've dragged your player into that slot, you're going to find what script you want to use on the player. So you click no function there and you choose the script you want to use. So we want to use player fire. Mine's at the bottom there. And then you want to choose the function that you want to actually use on player fire. Now, you might be thinking, I didn't write all these functions. No, of course you didn't, but there's some built-in ones from Unity. We're not going to do that. We're going to use fire projectile right there. Okay, fire projectile. Excellent. And now that we have that set up, it should just work. So let's go ahead and press play and see what happens. If I now click fire, I'm shooting a projectile. I'm shooting it from a bit of an odd place though, aren't I? Why is that happening? So if I move my player around a little bit, I'm still shooting it from the same spot, right? So what's happening is when we are instantiating our projectile, we aren't actually putting it in the right place. So we're going to need to go back and add that, okay? But we are firing. We have got our basics here working, right? When we click a button, our action takes place. We fire our projectile. So let's really quickly go back to our player fire script. Sorry, that's player health. Let's go to player fire. And we need to add one step in here. We need to add position the projectile on the player. Okay, and we can do that by saying cloned projectile dot, which means go to the cloned projectile and do something. And from there, we're going to say transform dot. So go to the transform. Remember, transform is a component on every game object that contains information about the position, rotation, and scale of that object. And then on the transform, we're going to go to position. And we're going to set that position using the equal sign. We're going to set that position to something. And on the right-hand side of this position setter, we're going to put in what you want to set it to. And we want to just set it to our player's position. Well, how do we get that? Our player fire script is attached to the player. So we just need to go to our own, this script's own transform. And we do that by just typing transform with nothing before it. Okay, that goes to the transform of this object that has the script on it, right? So if we have something before it, it goes to a different object's transform. But if there's nothing, there's no dot right before transform, that means it's going to our transform, in this case, the player's transform. So transform dot position. So this will take our cloned object and set its position to our player's position. Now what you could do here, optional, add an offset, and you can use a public variable for this. This would let you have your bullet fire a little bit ahead of you or in a particular position on the player sprite if that is necessary for your game. You can also use that then to change the offset depending on the direction the player is facing, etc. But for now, we're going to just use the position of the player because that's enough for the basics. Okay, so let's go back to Unity after you've saved this. Make sure you save it. I'm back in Unity. Let's now try running this again. And if I click fire now, I fire from the position that I was in. Let's try down here. Same position. Now you might notice I'm always firing to the right. And that's because how we set up the velocity. We said X will be 10 to the right. Now for some games, that's actually fine. In some games, you always fire in the same direction. Think about scrolling shooters or even scrolling platformers. You may always be firing to the right or up or just depending on the game. However, if you want to change that, that's one of our challenges. So this, up until now, this has been the projectile firing working. That section is done. So your challenges that you could do here, you could change the fire velocity and based on which direction the player has moved to make the bullet fire in a different direction. How would you do that? You would add a new condition when the player presses a button. Well, we already know how to do that. We've literally just done it. And we want the action to be changing a variable to a new value. We have a variable in our player fire script, which is our projectile velocity. We would simply need to change projectile velocity to be a different value. So you could add some other functions here like move up, move down, move left, move right. And in Unity, you could add in your buttons. So for up here, you could have multiple things happen when you click. So if you look at on click in a button, you have a plus here. You can add extra functions. Okay, so if you want your direction of your shooting to change based on where you last looked, you can add new functions there and you can change them. So you maybe take a look at how your movement is working in order to see an example of that in progress. Okay. Another option you could add here is you could add a cooldown to make sure the player can only fire at a certain rate. And if you want to make the button work when held down, you definitely want to add this, because otherwise you're going to be creating a truly ridiculous amount of projectiles. All right. So for that, you would need to add a extra condition when the player performs an action, so firing, and then the action for that would be to record the time when you fired. And then you'd need to add an additional condition to whenever you're firing. Instead of only firing whenever you press a button, you need to also check, so a condition here, that your time since you fired has been enough. Okay, now we're going to do some timing stuff later in this tutorial. So if you're not sure how that timing would work, keep watching, do the timing stuff we're going to do later, and then come back to it. That might help you with that challenge. So our next section here is to make this projectile actually deal damage, because right now it just fires, and if you had an enemy there, it would just fly past it harmlessly and not do any damage to the enemy, which is not what we want. So how do we make this actually deal damage to an enemy? Our condition and action here is our condition when our projectile hits a certain object type, in this case enemies, we want to then action destroy an object, the enemy in this case. I'm trying to phrase these actions and conditions a bit generically so that you can then take your knowledge you've learned in this tutorial and apply it elsewhere. Like, these are building blocks you can use to build your own code. So first of all, let's start with the action this time. We want to create a script that will allow our player to deal damage. And we're going to assign this script to the projectile in this case, because the projectile is what's actually going to deal the damage. So let's create a script. Down in our scripts folder here, create C# script, player damage. Remember, no spaces and capitalize both words. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and reload my solution since it was being cranky. If that ever pops up, as long as you don't have anything saved or not saved there, then you can just reload solution. It won't cause a problem. Okay, so we've got player damage here. I'm actually going to again remove these two functions, so we just have a blank class to start with. And we're going to add a function called kill enemy. It's going to be nice and simple. It's going to be public void kill enemy. And we need this function to have an argument. It's going to be a game object, and it's going to be called enemy. So remember, what is an argument or parameter to a function? This is information that the code that's calling this function is going to give to our function to use. Okay, so the code calling kill enemy will pass in some information, and this code will then use that information. So it's declaring basically a temporary variable to hold that info. All right, so enemy is just a variable, just like any other variable. It's a blank box, and it gets filled in when something calls kill enemy. And now we can use it. So we're going to use a very, very simple function called destroy, and then we just pass in the game object we want to destroy, in this case enemy. Very, very simple. But I'm doing it this way so you can see that you could have any action here. So this is our action. Kill the enemy using destroy. But you can have any action here. So you can use this like a building block, right? You can have some other function there. Okay, now that's our action complete. We now need to use a condition here. So let's go ahead and let's add our condition, and we want our condition to be when the projectile hits a certain object type ... and it's enemy, and then we're going to do our action. And let's change this action text down here to say destroy an object. In this case, it will be the enemy. So you can see this is nice and generic. So our condition is when the projectile hits a certain object type. So when you're testing if something has hit something else, there's only two types of functions you want to use. You want to use either trigger or collision functions. And in our case, remember that we made our projectile a trigger, so we're going to use a trigger function here. Now within that, there's a few different options. You can do something when the trigger first overlaps, which is on trigger enter. You can do something every frame that the trigger is overlapping, and that is on trigger stay. And then you can do something when the trigger leaves. Now in this case, we don't want the projectile to only kill the enemy after it leaves, or we don't need it to kill it every frame. We only need to kill it once when it first touches it. So on trigger enter is the correct function to use. And we're in 2D here, so it's going to be on trigger enter 2D. So we can do that by typing in void on trigger enter 2D collider 2D collision. All right, so if you weren't sure what this function was called, I often have to look it up because I'm not convinced that it will be good. It will not be correct because I don't trust my memory. So you can always type in Unity trigger enter, and if you're not sure what it is, you'll see on trigger enter collider. And then if you're like, oh wait, I need the 2D version, you can look that up and you'll get a bunch of stuff on here, but this is one you want. You can notice it's purple because I've obviously looked at it recently. And you get on trigger enter 2D and it's collider 2D. So you can see how it's actually used. If you scroll down in the documentation here, on trigger enter 2D collider 2D, and they've called it col. We can call it whatever we want. Okay, but that's the important part. So if you're not sure what you're typing, that's what you want to use. Okay. And let's actually call this, instead of collision, let's call it other collider, because that's specifically what it is. This is going to be the other thing that we bumped into. So if this player damage is attached to our projectile, that other thing is hopefully going to be the enemy. Okay, so how do we actually use that? Let's go ahead and check what the other collider is. How do we check that? How do we know what it is? That's very vague, Sarah. Okay, so what you want to use is something called a tag, and I'll show you how to set those up in Unity. Basically, every game object in Unity can have a tag, and you can set up what tags are possible in your project, and you can use this to identify types of objects. So instead of just checking for a specific name, because that's really likely to be wrong. When an enemy is cloned, for example, if it's spawning, it'll have a different name than if it was just there. When you copy enemies, they're going to get like a 2 and a 3 attached to them. And maybe you have multiple enemy types, but you want this to do the same thing no matter what enemy type it is. You don't want to base this on the name. So an easy way to do it is to make all enemies have the enemy tag. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to say if other collider dot compare tag, and we're going to put in the tag we want here. In this case, we're going to say enemy. Oops, without weird capitalization. Right? I'm going to make sure I spell it correctly. I'm going to make sure that my E is capitalized. Right? The reason that's important is because when we put the tag for our enemy in, it has to match exactly. If there are any misspellings or changes in capitalization, this code will not work. So spelling, unfortunately, is really, really important in your code to make sure that everything works properly. Okay, so let's go ahead and say if other collider compare tag enemy. What does that mean? Compare tag is going to return true or false, depending on what the tag is on the enemy. So we're going to check the other collider. We're going to see what tag it is. If the tag is in fact enemy, it's going to return true. If the tag is not enemy, it will return false. So the content of this will be either true or false. So if it's easier for you to think of it this way, you can say equals true, but you actually don't need that part, right? But we're going to say if compare tag enemy equals true. So if the enemy, or if the thing we bumped into is actually an enemy, then we're going to perform our action. And that action is kill enemy. And we're going to pass in other collider.gameObject. So that will kill enemy, and we need to tell it, remember, our kill enemy function requires something to be passed into it. That's a parameter there, an argument to the function. So we have to give it some information inside those parentheses. So we're going to tell it what object it should be destroying. And that's the object that's attached to this collider. So we got a collider that we bumped into. The game object that attached to it is going to be the enemy in this case. All right, let's add a little note up here as to what we're actually doing. So check if the object we collided with has the tag we are looking for. Enemy in this case, with a capital E. Right. Okay, that is our player damage script done. That will actually do, it will kill the enemy whenever this thing touches it. So let's go back to Unity. Okay, in Unity here, we have our projectile, and we're going to add this script to our projectile. And remember that our projectile is in the project folder now. It's not out in our scene because remember, we're going to be copying it from the file rather than from the scene in case something happened to that projectile in the scene. We wouldn't want it to get destroyed and then our copying wouldn't work anymore. So click on your projectile in the project folder. You can still add stuff to it there. And we're going to go ahead and just drag our player damage into there. Get on there. Player damage is now on it. So our player damage is on the projectile and that's working properly. Now we need an enemy to actually destroy because we don't actually have one in the scene right now. So I'm going to go ahead and add an enemy from my stuff here. Oh, I need to actually zoom in. So let me click on my player to do that. And I'm going to add this enemy that I have set up already. Well, it's not actually set up. I'll show you how to do that. So our enemy has been added. In order for a collision with this enemy to work, we need to give it a collider. Let's go ahead and add components. Collider. I'm just going to give mine a box collider, nice and simple. You can do what you like with yours. We are not going to mark this collider as a trigger because our enemy probably should be able to collide with walls and things. So we're not going to mark it as a trigger. I'm going to give my enemy a rigid body, but I'm not going to give it any gravity so it doesn't just fall out of the scene immediately. And it's not going to move right away or anything. It's just going to have a rigid body so that it can be affected by physics. And the last thing I need to do with this enemy is give it a tag. Okay, so if you look up here at our, I'm just going to fix my window there slightly so it's not so confusing. If you look up here at the the tag on the left at the top, so tag, you'll see there's some tags already added, but we're going to go ahead and add a new tag. So if you click on tag, untagged there, and go to add tag, that's going to add something. Make sure you have your enemy selected there. We can add our own custom tags. So by default, I have one here already called ground that I think was added to make jumping with ground work properly so that you can't jump infinitely. We're going to add a new tag. You may not have anything in your list and that's okay. And make sure here when you add this new tag that your spelling and capitalization match exactly to what you have in your code. So let's do enemy with a capital E. That's how I spelled mine, how I capitalized mine in my code. And I'm going to click save. And now I have an enemy tag there. So if I click back on my enemy here and I go up to tag and choose enemy, I now have a tag for the enemy on him. Okay? So you have to add it first before you can choose it. So my enemy now has a tag. So if I now press play and I press my fire button, my enemy is destroyed when I fire it. But if I go down to the spike, which also has a collider on it because it has to so that I can get killed by the spike, and I click fire, it does not destroy the spike. And that's the important thing. You don't want this bullet to destroy everything in its path, or maybe you do. If you want that, you can remove the tag check. But if you most of the time you don't want this to destroy everything in its path, you only want it to destroy enemies. So that's what you can do here. Okay, so at this point, we now have an enemy which can be killed by a projectile. Now, you may be thinking, but Sarah, I don't want my enemies to die in one hit. That's too easy. Okay, it's more complicated to add health, and as a beginner, you may want to evaluate whether that's important for your game. However, if you feel it is, then a challenge for you would be to add health to these enemies. And you can look at the player health tutorial that I did previously for how to do this. Okay, you can make the enemy, instead of killing the enemy, the action to be kill enemy whenever the projectile hits them, you can make it change the enemy's health. You'll need to get the health component off of the enemy. You'll make a script for health for the enemy's health. And you'll need to then add an extra condition and action so that whenever the health reaches 0, it then kills the enemy. And if you want that health to display visually, that's even more complicated. You can do something kind of similar to what we did with the player health, but you'll need to have individual health bars for the enemies. They need to be in the world space, which is more complicated. So I would recommend for a beginner to maybe avoid that for now. All right, another possible challenge here, you may want to use this script instead of a firing projectile that shoots a projectile far away. Maybe you want a Mario-style stomping ability. And if you want that, you can make basically a projectile that's just attached to your player around their feet. And that means that whenever their feet jump onto the enemy, it kills the enemy. Another challenge you may want to alter this code is that whenever you destroy the enemy, maybe you also want it to destroy the bullet so the bullet doesn't pierce through multiple enemies. And you can do that in your code where you kill the enemy. You can also then destroy, you would add something like destroy game object, which would destroy the game object the script is attached to. All right, so if you want to do that, that can make your bullet not pierce. Okay, so those are some challenges that you could add some different functionality to your game. We do have a couple more things I'm going to cover here. So first of all, I'm going to show you how to do a player attack animation. So that's pretty easy to set up. If you've got your player selected, you can go to the player's animations. So you may already have some. I have animations for this player already. If you don't, this will create an animation for the player. You can then add a new clip. I'm going to put this in the animation section and I'm going to call it attack. And my attack animation is really simple. It's just a single frame. It's my player having, that's actually not it. Let's just get rid of that. It's my player having a kind of creepy glowing eyes to show he's shooting his lasers out of his eyes. Just something simple to show that something's happening. And it is very good to have an animation for the player attacking, even if they're shooting something, because it lets you or player see that they have done something. You want to always give the player feedback on their actions. Okay, so I've added this animation, but then if I click on my animator window, this animation has been added, but it's not connected to anything. So you can see the attack animation was added there, but it's not connected to anything. So what I'm going to do is add a new parameter over here. So I've got parameters selected at the top. I'm going to click plus, trigger, and we're going to call this, let's call it attack with lowercase a. Notice I matched my other ones there, lowercase a. So make sure that you kind of match whatever parameters you maybe already have. If you don't have any of this yet, I'm not going to do a full introduction on how the animation system works. You need to watch some previous tutorials for that. But you don't have to have a full animation system for this attack animation to work. You just need to have an idle and an attack. You can go back to. You need to be able to go back to an idle animation. So if you don't already have one, you can add a new idle animation at the bottom there. And animations can be a single frame. That's okay. They don't have to be multiple frames of animation. Okay, so I've got an attack, I've got a trigger here, but I still don't have any transitions. So I'm going to click on my any state and do a make transition to attack, because I want my player to be able to attack no matter what they're doing. If they're walking or standing there or whatever, no matter what situation they're in, they're going to transition to this attack animation and do the attack. All right, I'm going to click on this arrow here, and in the bottom right corner, we'll see my information about how this transition works. So I don't want this to be based on time. Instead, I want my transition duration to be 0. I want it to happen instantly. And I want it to happen at exit time of 0. And I want to make sure exit time is now unticked. So I ticked it just to change exit time to 0. But then I unticked exit time. We do not want exit time ticked. Untick it. We do want down here in conditions, we want something. So we're going to go to when attack is triggered. And you notice there won't be anything on the right-hand side because attack is just a trigger. So there's only one way for a trigger to happen. It's if the trigger has been received, it happens. Right, then from attack, I'm going to make a transition down to idle. And I'm going to say this one will have an exit time. We just want to, after our attack animation plays, we want to go back to the idle. So what we don't want is, if you see down here in the preview, it looks really bizarre, and that's because we've given it a fixed duration. We do not want our transition to take time. We want our transition to take 0 time. But our exit time, we want it to be at the end of the attack animation. Now, if you just put 1 there, it's going to do something weird. So I usually put 0.99 to put it nearly at the end. That's 99% of the way through the animation. If you put 1, it's going to try to merge into the next animation, and it's going to look really weird. So put 0.99. Okay, so now we have a transition from any state to attack that happens when the attack trigger has been received, and a transition from attack to idle that happens at the end of the attack animation. Now, one thing I haven't done is actually properly set up the end of this animation. So to do that, I'm going to go back down. I've got my player selected. I've got the attack animation selected from the drop down. I'm going to click on that sprite and add an end time in a little bit into the animation by just duplicating it. So I've just copied this set of keys, Control C, and chosen where I want the end time to be, and did Control V. And that will make my animation last a little bit of time, because otherwise it's going to happen instantly and you're not going to see it. All right, so I need to give it some time. If your animation actually has multiple frames, you won't need to do what I just did. This is just if you only have 1 frame of animation, you want to make sure you can actually see it. You need to maybe duplicate that frame and put it a little bit farther along. Okay, so let's actually see if this has worked. My guy looks a little bit intense there now. You can see his eyes are like glowing. So I'm going to now... we need to actually trigger this animation. So this is our action done. All right, I didn't really go over actions and conditions here. Our action is now set up. The action is to, trigger this animation that we've got here. Now we need to actually cause it to happen. So let's go ahead and go into our player fire script that we just created earlier. All right, this is the first script. So player fire is the one on the player, not player damage. That's on the projectile. The fire script is on the player because that's the one actually firing, right? And we are going to add a new functionality to this. So after we create and fire this thing, we're going to play our animation, play firing animation. How do we do that? We need to get our component for it. So we need to store this somewhere. Let's make a variable for it. Animator, player animator. And let's put a note of what we're doing. Declare a variable to hold the animation on our player. And we're not going to make a new animation here. We're just going to get the animation that's already on our player. So get the animation already attached to our player so we can use it. So player animator equals get component animator. Okay, and notice that there's nothing before get component, and that means we're going to do get component on ourselves. So there's nothing beforehand with a little dot, not like up here we had clone projectile dot get component. We're not doing that here. We're just doing get component. So we don't have anything ahead of time. That means we're doing it on ourselves. Okay, I've accidentally added an extra parenthesis there. All right, so we are what component are we getting? We're getting an animator component. All right, and so that's being stored in our variable that we declared. All right, we need to use this animator component. So use the animator component to trigger an animation change for attacking. And so all we have to do is player animator dot set trigger, and this is where it's really important to spell and capitalize exactly as we did in the animator. Oh, you don't remember what you put? Well, that's okay. Go back to your animator. So click on your player, go to the animator for them, and see mine is a lowercase a attack. Right? That's what we're going to use. So set trigger attack. Notice I use set trigger here, not set int or set bool or anything like that, because our attack type, the type of parameter, is a trigger. All right, that should work. So now let's go back to Unity. Make sure you save your script. Back to Unity, back to our game, press play. All right, let's move my guy a little bit, and then let's fire. And look at that, he's got creepy eyes when he fires. And he only does it for a second, but that's okay. It's enough time to see it. All right, so hopefully you can see it on your screen. I know the frame rate might be a little bit low, but hopefully you can see that. So it's working properly for me. All right, so what else can we add here? Well, there's one more thing that we really need to add, and that's, let me just go ahead and press play again. And I want you to take a look at my hierarchy, which will show all the objects in the scene. And I'm just going to click fire a whole bunch. Can you see what's happening? Can you see how this might be a problem, right? This is gonna cause a memory to just keep being filled up and filled up and filled up, and your game's gonna slow down because also processing all these bullets. And so the more you run your game and the more bullets you fire, the slower your game is going to become. And it also might do weird things with gameplay. You might not want these bullets to last forever. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a timed destruction to these bullets. They're going to die after a certain amount of time. And this is when I said earlier, if you don't know how to do timing stuff, I'm going to show you how to do that here. And you can use this, the timing logic that I give you to use in other situations. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that out. All right, so what is our condition in action? Let's think about that first. First of all, our action will be to destroy a bullet. Destroy the bullet, destroy an object. In this case, the object that's on us. Our condition will be when a certain amount of time has passed since the bullet was created in this case, but a certain amount of time since something. Okay, so this will show you how to do a timer, how to check if a certain amount of time has passed since some event. Okay, and hopefully that will help you. That's a really, really useful bit of logic. I use it in every single game. It's absolutely vital to every game you ever make. So it's really important to learn that bit of logic and learn it well. So let's go ahead and try that. We're going to go ahead and create a new script called time destroy. So I'm going to right click in my script here. I'm going to create a C# script and call it timed destroy. I'm going to open that script up. I'm going to reload my solution because Visual Studio wanted me to. All right, and in this case, I'm going to leave this start function and update function alone because we're going to actually use them this time. Okay, so first of all, we need a couple of things. We need a public variable. So this is going to be a Unity editor variable, and that's going to be public. And that's going to be a float because in Unity, our time is measured in float. And a float is a type of variable, a type of number that includes decimal points. So that's how time is measured in Unity. So let's call this a life span, right? Or let's just call it time, we'll call it lifespan. And this is, let's just put a note here of what this means. So this is our number of seconds the object should live for. And in fact, let's call it, instead of lifespan, let's just call it goal time, right? Because that's a little bit more generic and it maybe will help you think about how your timer works, because I want you to be able to use this for other situations. So public float goal time, and that's the number of seconds that your object should be alive for, or your max time on the timer, okay? And then we're going to have a private variable used internally in the script. Okay, these are variables that are not public, are not exposed in Unity. And we're going to have a private variable called, it's a float again, because it's going to be for time, and it's going to be start time. And this is the timestamp that our timer is starting at. Okay. So this is going to record the timestamp. Now, what is a timestamp? That's the absolute time at that point. Okay, and in Unity, a timestamp equals seconds since game started. That's what a timestamp is in Unity. So if you have one that happens immediately when the game starts, the timestamp will be zero. Also, why have I called this star time? Start time. There we go. Start time. What? Start time. So start time will contain the amount of seconds as the game started whenever we set it. Okay. So when do we set it? Well, let's set it in start. So start time equals time.time. Wow, there's a lot of times in this sentence. This is nice and confusing. All right. Time.time. Let's put a note here. Time.time equals current timestamp. I keep noticing I'm making spelling errors here. Time.time is the current timestamp. Time since the game started. So you can always access what the current timestamp when the code runs is by using time.time. So what this is going to do is when our bullet is spawned, which is when start will happen, is when the bullet spawned, we will record into our variable, we'll store into our start time variable the current time, the timestamp. So if you fire a bullet the moment the game starts, then start time will be 0. But most of the time, start time will not be 0. It will be some other amount. Then, in update, once per frame, we're going to check what is the current time and is it after when we should be ending. All right, let's calculate our end time. That's going to make this a lot easier. So float end time. We're going to make a variable here. Declare a variable to contain our end timestamp to be used for comparisons. Okay, so we need to know when we started. We need to know when our object is supposed to stop. So we can say the end timestamp is just the start timestamp plus how long the object should live. Timer max. Okay? So, end time equals start time plus goal time. Okay? That should be pretty clear. You have a start time. So say you wanted to start something at 3 o'clock. You wanted to end something an hour later. So your end time is 3 plus 1 hour is 4 o'clock. That's exactly the same thing that's happening here. Your object is spawned at time equals 1. You want it to live for 3 seconds, so your end time is 4 seconds. All right, it's the same kind of thing. So now we want to check if our current time is greater or equal to our end time. If it is, perform our action. Okay? So if current time, so let's say, and what is current time? Remember, current time is time.time. So if time.time is greater than or equal to our end time, then action destroy this object. Okay, so let's just go over this really briefly. We get an end time, we calculate the end time, we compare our current time to our end time, and if that is true, so if the current time is in fact at the end time or later, so greater than means after, later, right? If our current time is greater or equal to our end time, then we're going to destroy the game object that this script is attached to because it's called time destroy. Now, if you're making a timer for something else, you would change what that action is, right? That's what you change, the action inside this area. But everything else could stay the same. So if you're making a timer, for example, to check if the player is allowed to fire, you could keep everything else the same and just check this section, okay? So hopefully that helps you out. If you're adding any other timer code. This stuff doesn't always have to happen inside update either. So for the example, for firing your object, that would happen inside, if you're going to use timer code there, it would happen inside our fire projectile. And you would only do all this stuff. That's the action, right? You'd only do all of that stuff if you made it inside this if statement. Okay, so that's how you would implement that timer for some other situation. Okay, let's test this and see if it works. So what we want to see, if we go into Unity, we want to be able to click on our projectile. We want to add time destroy to it. So click on your projectile in your prefabs folder in the project, drag time destroy onto it. And then if you look at your time destroy, you should see you have a goal time. Let's put 2 seconds for now, 2 seconds. And now let's go ahead and try firing a projectile and seeing if it works. So keep an eye on the hierarchy here. I'm going to fire. And after 2 seconds, that projectile is gone. So I can add a whole bunch of them, and they're going to be there for a while, and then they slowly disappear after their 2 seconds have passed. So hopefully that was useful for you. What you can do now, using this information, is you can make a melee attack. If you don't want your player actually shooting things, you can make a melee attack. You can use the exact same stuff we've done here. All you have to do is on your projectile, you make that time very, very low. So maybe like 0.2 I don't know. And you change it so that it's invisible. So let's go ahead and turn off the sprite render on the projectile. If I do that, and I fire, nothing's happening. You can see that I'm firing because my little eyes have turned scary. But if I now go over close to this guy, oh, he's gone away. Come back. Here, we'll look at him over here. Oh no, he's gone forever. Let's get closer to him and try firing. Now what will happen here is I'll maybe need to add it a little bit longer because it might not be enough. Oh no, it's enough. It's there. So he got killed by my melee attack there. And if you have an animation that shows your player actually swinging their sword, it's going to look a lot better. Okay, so that will help you to add a melee attack if you want to. You can use this exact same code. You don't have to change any code to do that. This has hopefully covered a lot of the ways that you can use player attacks. Now, obviously, there are many more that could be done, but this is the basics. Hopefully, this was useful to you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below, and I will help you as soon as I can. Good luck with your game, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.